the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. It's become an infamous kind of study because the data for the study was collected from 60 to 70, late 60s to early 70s, and then the data was just put in a drawer and never looked at because, the results did not fit what the researchers were hoping to find. And then part of the results, not the full set, was published in the late 80s, like nearly 20 years later. And then now, nearly 40 years later, another scientist was able to find the data that was never published before and do some analysis. And it's funny, if you do a Google search on Minnesota Coronary Experiment, you'll come across this a Washington Post article. Let me go in here. This is the article here that we'll go through, but let's check out this Washington Post article first. And I think I'm covering a part of the screen here, so let's fix that. Here we go. We'll just do that for now. Learning how to use this. So it's quite a sensational title to the article. This study 40 years ago could have reshaped the American diet, but it was never fully published. Dun, dun, dun. So I've highlighted some of the important parts of the article. Let's go over it together. The long-belated saga of the Minnesota Coronary Experiment may also make a broader point about how science gets done. It suggests just how difficult it can be for new evidence to see the light of day when it contradicts widely held theories. Yes, absolutely. This is exactly the case in many different fields of science. There is already a working model that people have of what they're studying and how it works and behaves. And when there's new data that comes out that contradicts it, it takes a long time for that data to come through just because, it's hard for people to be able to change the model and what they believe in. And this is exactly, I think, what happened in this case. Let's go further. So Ramsden and colleagues, this is the gentleman who actually ended up finding some of this old data and reanalyzing it. They discovered the missing data during their research examining the potentially harmful effects of linoleic acid. I already mentioned this. This is the omega-6 PUFA. They were looking at potential harmful effects of linoleic acid on human health. So, and I already mentioned that this is a key constituent of vegetable oils, which I defined as actually seed oils. So, preliminary research suggests a link between linoleic acid and diseases such as chronic pain, Ramsden said. And humans have been consuming it in larger quantities than their bodies may be prepared for. Before the advent of agriculture, humans got 2 to 3% of their calories from linoleic acid, according to the new paper. Today, however, most Americans, awash in cooking oils and oils added to snack foods, get much more. Exactly. So this is not something that used to be in human diets. This is not something that we've probably evolved to. And now we're increasing consumption of it in drastic amounts. And this is exactly what the study looked at and tried to see what effects this could have on people's health. And the results of what the study showed was very against what they were expecting. And this is part of the reason why it was never published. And this is what the author of this Washington Post article says. It's not exactly clear why the full set of data from the Minnesota experiment was never published. The results of the study were never touted by the investigators. Partial results were presented at an American Heart Association conference in 1975. And it wasn't until 1989, 14 years later, that some of the results were published, appearing in a medical journal known as Arteriosclerosis. So the principal investigators were Ansel Keys and Ivan France for this study. And Ansel Keys is well known as like the father of the diet heart hypothesis and the person who kind of created the American Heart Association that pushed the recommendation of reducing saturated fat and instead taking on polyunsaturated fat. He's a really well-known figure. His image is on the cover of Time magazine, which I used for the thumbnail of this article. But so why was this data only partially published in 89? Like well over 10 years after the data was collected. Well, this gentleman, Stephen Broste, who's a biostatistician, he was actually a student at the University of Minnesota and used the full set of data for his master's thesis in 81. That's crazy. So he used the data for his thesis in 81, and that was never published either. And only part of the data was then published 8 years later after his thesis. Anyways, part of the problem, Brosty's suggesting in an interview, may have been the limits on statistical methods at the time. Computer software for statistics wasn't as readily available as it is today, so at the time of the study, it wasn't as easy to know how significant the data was. Fair enough, he's being charitable to these principal investigators, but like, how long does it take to eventually get computer software to be able to analyze this data? It took them over 10 years to just publish part of the set of data. Why weren't they able to get the computer software to analyze the whole set? Here it says Brosty completed his thesis several years after the last patient had left the trial, but his thesis was not published in a journal. Now here's what this statistician thinks. Brosty also suggested that at least part of the reason for the incomplete publication of the data might have been human nature. The Minnesota investigators had a theory that they believed in, that reducing blood cholesterol would make people healthier. Indeed, the data was widespread and would soon be adopted by the federal government in the first dietary recommendations. So when the data they collected from the mental patients conflicted with this theory, the scientists may have been reluctant to believe what their experiments had turned up. Yes, absolutely. They are the ones that put forth this diet heart hypothesis, and then when they went to collect really solid evidence to try to prove it as best they can, they got results that disproved it. So of course they're not going to be motivated to publish this data. That's my take on it. Let's get to the actual